Thank you, Dr. Wien, and thank you all for being here. Let's talk about Italian artifact restitution. The order of my presentation will go as follows. I'll give you a short introduction to what restitution is and what it means for Italy. Then we'll go through my methodology, as this is a discourse analysis. I'll talk about my findings, and then ultimately the conclusions and paradoxes we're left when it comes to restitution, specifically about time and provenance and their role in the meaning-making of ownership. Two words that I'm going to be throwing around a lot today, and we're just going to define them right up front. Provenance, which is defined as the history of ownership of a valued object or work of art, and then restitution or repatriation. Those are two terms that are used interchangeably depending on what region of the world you're in. And that just means the return of a stolen cultural object. And the important part there is the word stolen, because that has implications on who owns that artifact. And just to give you some brief background, the primary international institution we'll be talking about here is UNESCO. Because in 1970, UNESCO had its convention for the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural property. 131 parties signed off onto that, including Italy and the United States. And so that is really the foundation for restitution as we know it. All right, so the current state of Italian restitution. Now, Italy has a very low rate. There's only 4 confirmed UNESCO cases of restitution. So the question becomes, well, why is there such a low rate, especially after this convention was specifically designed to increase that rate? So what I started looking at is the bilateral agreement between the United States and Italy to try to help explain this paradigm. The 2 actors that were engaged in that bilateral agreement are international task forces and museums themselves. They are the institutions charged with responsibility when it comes to ownership and restitution. So that gets me to my research questions. Well, who owns history and what accounts for weaknesses of established legal norms? And then how have international actors such as museums and government task forces constructed meanings about ownership through discourses that include or exclude acknowledgement of provenance? My methodology here was a discourse analysis, specifically from 2 separate groups, international task forces as well as museums. So the darker gray region up there are the museums themselves from Italy and the United States. The lighter gray are the task forces. And what I looked at here are 3 sources for these discourses. The Twitter feeds for all of them, media sources that were included specifically in those tweets, as well as website data from all of the above. Okay, so finding number 1, this comes to task forces. I found that there is a shared understanding of illicit provenance or ownership between international task forces. They use the same words when constructing meanings, such as stolen or repatriated. They even have joint press conferences that they've coined as repatriation ceremonies. They have a shared meaning for the necessity for international cooperation, but it is important to note here that they never include, throughout my research, museums when it comes to that need for cooperation. I included an example up here of a perfect case in which the task forces were communicating with each other, creating some sort of shared meaning of ownership. You have here a tweet by the State Department, which is the U.S. task force, as well as the FBI, speaking to the Italian Carabinieri. And they are using shared words such as stolen, as well as talking about Roman artifacts. And it's important to note here the temporal indicator there, that they are talking about ancient Rome, which implies that the ancient Romans, or contemporary Italians, have stake and ownership in their history. Finding number 2. This talks about provenance transparency, and I found that United States museums published more provenance information than Italian museums. And that's off of 37 different web pages. You can see for yourself, 100% of the United States museums included information such as catalog codes, dates of acquisition, and importantly, where and who they acquired their artifacts from. But when you turn to the Italians, 80% of those museums leave that section completely blank. they would have a description and a photo of the artifact, but you would have no idea where it comes from. And I'll explain why that might be in a little bit. Finding number 3, and this comes to visual context. I found that both US and Italian museums excluded visual context on their websites. So in all cases, it looked like a diagram or picture here on the left. But the Twitter feeds of the museums, they tell a different story. You can see here that the US museums still include the neutral background. There's no context, cultural context for that artifact. But look on the right there. That's from an Italian museum, and you can see in the background there, they have reconstructed some sort of Italian villa to show some kind of cultural context for that artifact. There's no neutral backdrop. It has significance, symbolic significance, and you can tell that the Italian museums are tying that cultural context to how they're considering ownership in this situation. That led me to 3 important conclusions here. First, that task forces indicated a shared meaning-making of ownership and a shared exclusion of museums in that meaning-making. Second, you have the exclusion of provenance, and that calls into question what are the interests of those Italian museums. Third, the visual context indicates a difference in the role of time in restitution, specifically the temporal context of the pictures that we saw there. You have an ancient villa, and that tells you that there's some kind of link between ancient Rome and contemporary Italy, whereas the United States museums, they completely get rid of that context, and therefore they're severing contemporary with ancient. And that's important to know. Now, these findings, they lead me to several unanswered paradoxes that I find incredibly fascinating. First, why is it that those Italian museums exclude their provenance? Because all the literature suggests that that provenance information is how you prove legal standing in international courts. So therefore, it would be counterintuitive for them to not divulge that information, especially when they go and try to sue in UNESCO forums and institutions for this restitution. It also, lends thought into the Western traditions of those forums or legal pathways, because you can tell that the Western countries are valuing those numerical provenance information, while the Italians are not. Second, only the Italian museums are including the visuals in their tweets. So that tells us it tells us that the Italians now want to include that context for some sort of grounds of restitution, but that is completely counterintuitive to what they were doing with the provenance. So what explains that difference? Because if you're trying to sue for restitution, you need to include the link between contemporary and ancient as well as the numerical provenance. So why would Italians choose one over the other, and why would the Americans choose the opposite? So this leads us to future questions that I or others will research, hopefully me. First, why are museums excluded from those cooperative measures, specifically the Italian museums? And why don't those Italian museums publish their provenance? And that is the central question that I'm left with, because that is completely opposite to what the literature suggests should happen, what just common sense of legal norms and established norms should suggest. So it leaves more questions unanswered for future research. This is a selected bibliography that I have used. Obviously mine is more extensive, but these are the authors that are really pioneering the restitution scholarship, and these are the foundation for my current research. All right, thank you so much.